Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Thanks also to Brandon and to everyone here at LACP for the invitation to be a part of this. With it being Pride Month, I'm really grateful for this chance to highlight and to celebrate some artists who are making work about their experience as people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community. Tonight's event is called Art as Activism. But if you're familiar at all with the kind of work that Michael, Jeanette, and I make, you might find that to be an odd fit for the title, or us to be an odd fit for that title. Maybe a better title based on our work could be Activism Through Intimacy. Since we'll be hearing from two artists who are making work that is not so much overtly political, but rather more subversively vulnerable. And that's how I'd like to frame this talk and this time as we begin. It's a time to hear from a pair of artists who are making work about queer joy, beauty, and intimacy. And I believe that can serve as a balm and a bit of a counter agent to the growing negativity and the bad news that we've seen, especially in the last few months. As for myself, I'm not really a pessimist or an optimist. I'm really more of a realist. And so I think in times like this, we just have to name, address, fight, and mourn the attacks and the losses that are happening to the queer community. But also, I think we have to remember there's a lot more good being done than we know about or hear about, probably because social media loves to feed us all of the dark shit and help us focus on that without reminding us of the good as well. So the artists that we'll be hearing from tonight, I believe, are doing some of the good. Their lives and their work serve as activism against the dark and against the things that are oppressing right now. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. The first artist we'll hear from is Jeanette Spicer. Jeanette works with photography, mixed media, and performative video. Her work is deeply collaborative and concerned with the lack of lesbian representation, what the lesbian gaze is, and how the femme body can be reimagined and reclaimed. Jeanette received her MFA from Parsons, the New School, in 2013, and has since participated in a number of residencies and has worked as the education manager at Magnum Photos. She has taught at Pratt, the School of Visual Art, the International Center of Photography, among other places. Her work has been shown globally, and her first monograph, CC, was published in 2018 by Chris Graves Projects. Jeanette is also a freelance photographer for the New York Times and is a co-editor of a publication called Women, which we'll talk a little bit about later, which showcases marginalized communities of lesbian art and poetry. I also want to point out for her sake that Jeanette is joining us from Sweden this evening, which is posing an extra challenge for how early in the morning it is for her. So we're very thankful for her willingness to be here with us. So please welcome Jeanette Spicer.
Thank you so much, Kurt. And thank you to Brandon and Janice and everyone else. So I am going to attempt to share my screen. And yes, it is 2 a.m. for me. So hopefully I will be as sharp as I can be. I have 2 projects that really I'm focused on in terms of my photographic practice at this moment. The one that I feel like makes the most sense to talk about in this particular panel is called What It Means to Be Here. The other project is a series that I've been doing for about 12 years that focuses on, it's a collaboration with my mother and now with my partner, but it's really about sort of adult children and how they interact or engage with their parents as they age. So I didn't want to sort of keep that a mystery, but it felt like kind of too much to bring in along with this project here. That project, which is called Mother Right Now, is available on my website if you're interested in viewing that. And so this project here, What It Means to Be Here, is something that I started in 2018, and it's ongoing. And the images are not in any particular order in terms of when they were taken. And I feel like in terms of this project, there's a lot of different ways I could sort of address it and talk about it. There's sort of, I think, like most projects for people, there's like a number of things kind of going on. I feel like we were just talking about a Russian doll, but I feel like it's always sort of unpacking and unlayering things when I explain it. So really it was sort of birthed from the project that I think Kurt had mentioned, CC, which was a monograph that I published in 2018, which was really the first large project that I started after graduate school. And it was focused on my partner at the time. And I was sort of grappling with my sexuality and thinking about who is this person that I'm with and what work can I even make? And so I did a year of that and some other things in between. And then I started really becoming more in touch with myself and my sexuality and my photographic practice, and started thinking more about the fact that for me personally, I feel like I have a responsibility to share that with the world. And this project and my work in general isn't meant to speak to, it's not meant to represent, I should say, the lesbian community as a whole or the queer femme community as a whole. That's not my intention, and that's not what this work even represents. It's not nearly that diverse. But for me, it really is about my personal experience as a lesbian, and as a woman, and my community and friends and partner and lovers and people that are willing and interested in being in the work are typically people that I'm very close to, or that I share some sort of, relationship with. The people in the work are not strangers, they're not people that I hire. And people come and go from the project. There's been people who I photographed once. There's been people who have consistently shown up through the project for 4 years, 5 years. And so, like I said, there's sort of a number of things going on. I think as a woman and as a person who has been in my own work and in other people's work, and just a consumer of, what we see in society in terms of imagery of women. Women have been represented by men for men since the beginning of time, through the canon of art history. And more often than not, they're not realistic depictions of women. And the women that were making work, because women have been making work also since the dawn of time, are really overlooked, or their perspectives are not seen, or they're sort of invisibilized or written out of history. And then you add on to that, the lesbian community or the queer femme presenting community, and it's even more invisibilized. So since that is my community and that is my gaze and my perspective, I started thinking about, what does a lesbian gaze look like and what does that even mean? And the work is not meant to answer that question. It's just for my own exploration, really, and my own kind of prompt for the viewer to think about that as well. And again, it's not really documentary style. These are not, the people in the work matter to me and mean a lot to me, of course, but it almost isn't even about them per se. So like the titles of the work often don't include, people's names. Photographically, that's sort of like the content. And then photographically, I'm really interested in like the female form in a traditional way, but more so like, how can the body, the female or femme presenting body, be seen differently and played with in terms of space, lighting, different objects, the environment that we're in. And I think, I have a real interest in sort of surrealism and not always really having an idea of what I'm going to make until I'm sort of making the image. I have sketches and I have ideas in my mind, but those are more concepts. Like, for example, here, this is an image of someone who has, hairy legs and very long, quote, feminine hair. And so this sort of contrast against one another, I found to be really fascinating and interesting. And these are the things that I look for in people and in the images that I'm making, to sort of prompt myself and viewers to think about, a multitude of things. And in this image, it would be perhaps like gender, how do we read this person? How do we think about women having sex? How do we think about, female bodies and how they're represented and how they're seen. And I think for me, prompting a viewer to like reconsider that is what I find the most interesting. And I do that by, yeah, kind of like constructing these images. I do try to make them sort of play between being constructed and seeming somewhat natural. I think it's pretty obvious that they're constructed to a degree, and they're not meant to be extremely narrative, but they're meant to be sort of placed in between, having a little bit of a narrative, being somewhat constructed. Most of the images are staged to a degree, but often when I'm making images, I have maybe a sketch in mind or something comes to me in the moment, and then I turn and, one of my models or subjects is doing something even better or even more interesting. So it is staged, it is planned, but not always. And I think part of my question is, I think at the height of, AIDS in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, particularly like during ACT UP and that sort of time period, there was, a lot more lesbian bars and lesbian clubs and lesbian nights, particularly in, LA and San Francisco and New York. And having done some research and knowing some people from older generations, my generation didn't really, we have a lot of privilege, absolutely, as a gay and queer community, bi and trans, but we don't really have those spaces. And lesbians certainly don't have those spaces in the same way that gay men do. And I think a lot about the sort of absence of that. And, I think a lot of that has now gone online. And part of that is because of social media and online dating, and the online space being a space that didn't exist at that time. But also the need to really sort of put sex and BDSM culture in people's faces to show that sex could be pleasurable, could be fun, doesn't have to be a bad thing, doesn't have to, doesn't mean you're going to be unsafe or unhealthy necessarily. And I feel like I find a lot of work, particularly lesbian and femme presenting people's work or representations of them, to be kind of, more tame, or maybe not, more prude, and not really like going there regarding sex and intimacy. And that's fine, because that's what people want to make. But I'm interested in figuring out how to sort of represent that in a way that's, again, not like overt, not a documentary style. I'm not interested necessarily in documenting lesbian sex per se, but it's more about an alluding to something or thinking about boundaries. I think a lot about censorship. This is a good example of, social media is a part of all of our lives. And as a person with breasts, I constantly have to censor myself, the majority of the people in my work. And it's such a double standard. Instagram is extremely problematic in that way. And I don't make the images for Instagram, but I have such an awareness of the fact that my body and other people's bodies just are a problem for that platform and are a problem for a lot of other people. So I think about ways that I can sort of get around that, or even call that out even more. And I think it's also about, saying like, I'm here and my community is here and we exist. And, since sort of the beginning of time, like lesbians weren't even, for better or for worse, illegal, if you will, in the same way that, or the act of, in the same way that gay men were, or gay men having sex, or men having sex, which one could say is, better or worse, depending on your perspective. But, the fact is we weren't even taken seriously, in order to even be illegal, or for our actions to even be considered serious enough to even be regarded. So, it was this idea that two women would never even have sex. That couldn't even be real without the presence of a man. And, I don't take those things lightly. And even though that might not be the most recent mindset, as Kurt was mentioning before, we're, constantly sort of going through these ups and downs, and we're seeing a lot of backlash right now. And, for me as a lesbian, it doesn't feel that far off. And so it feels even more important for me to make work that feels like it nods to various things, but isn't necessarily telling you this is what this is and this is what you should think. And I really like to think of my work more as a way for viewers to enter in and be invited and think about all of these topics like gender signifiers and assumptions and sexuality and women having sex and representation of that or lack thereof. And just a different way in which we can see queer, femme, and lesbian physical bodies and forms differently. I must have talked for 10 minutes, I would say, at this point.
Yeah, you're right on.
Okay, I'm like, I think this is the last slide. So I think, yeah, so that sort of wraps it up for me. But I can also talk more about that once we talk as a group.
All right, great. Thank you, Jeanette.
Sure.
All right, we're gonna introduce our second panelist now, Michael Young. Michael is a lens-based artist who works primarily on long-term projects focused on identity, masculinity, and memory. He discovered his love of photography during his senior year of college in a class with Catherine Opie. After graduating, he remained an active, if yet private, practice while working as a full-time teacher, while also taking classes at ICP, CPW, and Penumbra. His work has been exhibited nationally at the Atlanta Photography Group, the Southeast Center for Photography, Filter Photo, the Center for Fine Art Photography, and here at the LACP. Internationally, he has had work shown in Madrid, Spain, at the Proust Museum in Norway, and at the Queer Festival in Heidelberg, Germany. Young's work has been published in Musée magazine, Der Grief, Fisheye magazine, among many online journals. Recently, he's been winning a number of awards, including the 2022 Lens Culture Critics' Choice Award. He had a top 50 placement in Photolucida's Critical Mass of 2021 and Feature Shoot's 2021 Emerging Photography Award. So please welcome Michael Young.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you so much, Janice, Brandon, Jason, Kevin, and the entire team at LACP for creating and opening a welcoming space for all photographers and lens-based artists. I think given what LGBTQ individuals are facing, not only here in the US, but also around the world, having an event like this is really special and providing us with this opportunity to legitimize the ever-growing need and importance of inviting a variety of voices and perspectives to the proverbial table is so essential to allowing us to get to understand ourselves and each other a lot better. So I'm going to start sharing my slides with you guys. So I'm just going to walk you through the slides that I'm going to talk about. I'll touch a little bit on my early influences and education, give you some really slightly scary images from undergrad to give you a basis of where I started and how mortified I am, but I'm going to be vulnerable here. Then going to walk you through 2 bodies of work, Hidden Glances, and maybe tomorrow. I probably won't get to the last one, but that's okay. We can always say that for another day. So I didn't get to photography, as Kurt said, until my senior year of college. I had taken a drawing class at freshman year and was totally mortified for myself in every single model. But right after I came out, Catherine Opie was coming to Yale, and everyone was like, you have to study with her. You need to take photography. And so I was fortunate enough to study with her for the year that she was at Yale prior to returning to UCLA, where she spent the next 25 years and just retired. So Kathy was really pivotal and important in my process because she not only was this fearless artist at the time who's creating quite controversial work, but she really asked us to take risks. And she asked us to take risks, but she also asked us to look back in time and to look at portraiture and paintings and to go back to Northern Renaissance Dutch paintings. And then when she started to see my work, she was like, check out Mapplethorpe, check out Peter Hujar, who at that time was pretty much not very well known. And then she also challenged us to dig deep into the FSA, group of photographers and those who traveled the country during the Great Depression. And I was assigned John Bashan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He was a more minor photographer at the time. But she really kind of opened my eyes to the idea that photography can be something more than just a beautiful picture. And so when I was there, I started to document the cruising sites around the university and taking pictures of different friends and locations that I had found online. The internet wasn't what it was. And so finding these places was a lot more tricky, but I lugged my camera around and took a bunch of different pictures of friends and spaces, both locker rooms, self-portraits. And I was really interested in seeing how the gaze and the male gaze changed. And I was really just kind of trying to find myself through art, similar to what Jeanette was saying. This art was very personal and there was nothing really political about it. It was me trying to find a way to express myself and to understand myself better through the work that I was doing. And so after I graduated, I began teaching and I didn't show work for a really long time. And I'll show you the work that I've been doing in Kentucky for 10 plus years, but the work that people seem to be, associating with me is the work that I began a few years ago called Hidden Glances. And I was really interested in finding a way to create a body of work that spoke about my time prior to coming out. I just remember those years of anguish, of the hemming and hawing, the feeling of being seen and not wanting to be seen, to look, to not look, the fear of being outed, the fear of a gaze lasting too long or a handshake, just feeling that minute nanosecond too long that would potentially make someone say, oh, he's gay. And so I went back and I was using calendars because as I was gathering these sources, I thought calendars would be the perfect opportunity to represent the time that I felt was lost, the time when I was in the closet and I wasn't out. And I began making these cutouts in a very traditional collage sense. And like many collages, they become this sort of additive thing where you remove a piece and you put it on another image. And I was making these cutouts and flipping them so that you couldn't see the actual male body. You could recognize that it was a male figure, but I was really interested in the backside of it because it was the marking of time in the calendar. But then I was like, okay, this is really boring and this isn't going to really fly for much longer than maybe 1 or 2 images. So it was one day when I actually put the work back into a box when I realized that in laying the space, laying the image that had the figure removed, that I thought there was something more interesting going on. And there began to create this push and pull between 2 different spaces, between the foreground and the background. And so therein lies the birth of the project. And so this is just a quick walkthrough of how the process goes. I usually start with one calendar, and being the type A person that I am, I tend to like to have parameters and limits to the way in which I work. So I start with one calendar. I work usually with artist tape. I break down the calendar into the 12 images, and working only within the 12 images, I seek out ones that I think are more interesting for either their background or for their silhouette. And then from there, what I go and I do is I'll remove all of the figure from one of the images and then place it on top of the other. And from there, later in the work, sometimes I'll even remove other pieces of the figure from the background to then pull it through to create more of a slightly confusing situation where the back is now coming out. So that's some of the later work. So these are the final pieces. And I'm really interested in that idea of the calendar being a marker of time, the idea that there is this compression of space, this compression of time. There is, similar to Jeanette's, there's this idea that I think of like what's being hidden and what's being revealed. And I think that's so true of so many of us prior to coming out. You want to be a part of it, but there's a fear and there's this longing and there's this internal conflict and strife. And how do I subvert and how do I take these images that are coming from vintage gay calendars and turn them into something? How do I recontextualize them and repurpose them into something that moves away from pornography? I still want them to be seductive and intriguing because I think it's a way to invite and engage people with the work, but it's more about the concepts that are behind it and that internal conflict that I've had. So some of them subvert the gaze from the model. Other times you'll see the eyes. So there's the question of who is the viewer, who is being seen. And I also, when I'm constructing them, only work with 2 images from the same calendar. But traditionally, the male figure in a lot of these publications are put right along the central vertical axis, so it can make for some boring compositions. So what I'll do is I'll intentionally splice the back image and then shift some of the images over to create different flows within the images before I finalize them. Sometimes there's multiple images, multiple individuals in an image. Sometimes I'm really interested in playing with the idea of what's going on in the background and can I kind of trick the viewer for a split second. So here, what looks like a shower curtain and water at first, at quick glance, almost looks like muscle. Like raw muscle, the skin's removed. Sometimes I ask the viewer to work a little harder to figure out the shape of the individual that's been removed. And as I've moved through the series and these images are somewhat in chronological order, I've begun to leave some of the pieces of the top image in. So here you see the hand on the left. And I really try to make conscious decisions as to how I lay them out. So that hand kind of aligning with the backbone of the sculpture. And I think that looking at a lot of sculpture and from Greek and ancient Roman times has been an influence in this work as well. Again, this is some of the later work where more body parts are left. And it's almost like this idea that I'm coming to terms with that image that's being removed, with the duality of both men existing in the same space. Here again is the gaze, but also a sort of nod in a way to the Cubist movement and the idea of trying to capture multiple perspectives of the face within the same picture plane. And this is one of the later ones where the hand from the back is actually coming over and laying on top of the top image. So we're finally starting to get the breakthrough of the 2 images shifting out of their own picture planes. So that kind of sums up Hidden Glances, and I've been tinkering with some other stuff as to maybe there's a part 2 to it, but that's kind of the essence of this body of work. The other long-term series that I've been working on is something that's been over 10 years in the making. And I started it when I took my first trip back. Well, I took my first trip to Western Kentucky, which is where my partner is from. He grew up about 2.5 hours north of Nashville in a small rural community in Muhlenberg County, which for a long time was a prosperous coal mining region and has since fallen on harder times. And for me, I was a stranger in a strange land, and my camera was a way for me to start to understand my partner, family dynamics, and how religion plays in this conservative, somewhat really slow to change community. And through the years, I've been documenting both family members and community members, and have sort of become attuned to how much place can shape identity, and how much conformity and conforming is so essential to surviving in this area. And there are these moments of push, but they're really, really subtle. And so this work is vastly quieter than hidden glances. So that in this image, for instance, this is Eric's cousin's wife, who's Pentecostal. And if one knows anything about Pentecostals, the women are not allowed to cut their hair, it just breaks off. And also they're supposed to have their arms and their legs completely covered. But Starla's a bit of a rebel, so she pushes up her sleeves. She'll sometimes wear slightly shorter dresses. And so she sort of toes the line.
Hey, Michael just says a warning, we'll have to cut in here pretty soon to do this, to start the panel stuff.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I didn't see the 3-minute warning. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. So really, this is an investigation of how like religion and place inform identity. It gives you just a taste. And we'll leave it there with a nice girl and a gun. No better way to end.
Right? Nothing to worry about there.
Nothing to worry about there. No, just a kid with a semi-automatic.
Right, right. But drag queens are the problem. So
yeah, exactly. Perfect segue. So, it's like all these projects I'm looking at approaching things either from a personal level to, to look at my subjects in an empathetic and an honest way, whether it be my own life or the life of others, and really to, find the universal and to understand. I think that's pretty much some of the main themes that kind of are running underneath some of those bigger topics that I'm trying to deal with in my own work.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a perfect transition. We're going to jump into a panel discussion right now with the three of us, and then there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. So if any of you want to drop a question in the chat, I think there was instructions there for you for that if you wish to. So we'll probably do that in about 10 minutes or so. But in the meantime, to frame the discussion, I was thinking about what Michael brought up there at the end, and Jeanette mentioned a little bit of this too. What strikes me about the three of us discussing this project is that we all do stuff that's quite personal and intimate, and that is unexpected for art as activism, possibly. At first glance, it might seem like our work isn't concerned with those issues, but it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes in photography, which is from Diane Arbus, who was actually quoting her teacher, Lisette Modell, saying that the more specific you are, the more general it will be. And so I think that really applies to with what we're looking at here with both of your works. The idea, if you share something specific, it's more likely to be vulnerable. It reaches a deeper interconnection with the viewer, and therefore connecting to far more people than if you just skated across the surface of something without any specificity. So I thought maybe I'd have each of you jump in and say a little bit about that idea of specificity in your work, and maybe how you've seen your work started at a place of specificity and then go on to something that connects into bigger ways or to something more general. If that makes sense, Jeanette, maybe we'll have you jump in first, and then kind of that tension of the specific and the general.
Sure. I think my brain would be working a little better if it wasn't
okay.
almost 3 a.m. I feel like that's a tough question, because I feel like I guess in the sense that I start work with people that I'm very close to, like I said, or that I know well, who don't model and they're familiar with their bodies, but they're not even like, dancers, or, there's nothing really like that is going on with them that's like draws me in. It's more like, this is a person that I'm close to who sort of identifies as gay, bi, queer, or something, and is willing to collaborate with me. And that's sort of like as specific as I get. And then I feel like when I pull back and I explain it to people, or I think about it, or I try to contextualize it, it has bigger and larger overarching themes. And I feel like that's similar with the work with my mom, where it is literally me and her, but it's not diaristic at all. It's really not about our relationship specifically in like a documentary type of way. So I think for me, it starts with people that my work starts with people that I know very well and intimately. And then the themes sort of, once I get going, I always have like a general theme, but I start to think about the viewer more, start to think about, what am I really trying to say? And how can this be, both specific, but also general. And again, like I said, it's not really about my subjects as like Sarah or Liz or whoever it might be. It's really about their bodies and what that body can represent to like a general viewer, like a larger sense. And they're aware of that. They're aware that it's not, I don't know if you know Jess T. Dugan's work, but I'm not driving around in a van across the country, which is great for history and for, the LGBTQ plus community. And we need work like that, but I'm not interested in making work like that. So it's really not about this person at this time in this place. So I think that's where my like specificity and more general elements come in.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have something to add to that, maybe?
Well, I think for me, I think working with vintage K calendars allows a certain demographic, a way in to connect with the work, perhaps on, a sort of level of memory, and that maybe they had seen those calendars when they were younger. They were certainly things that I didn't see when I was growing up, but I really do think that within the personal, like you said, can within the personal you find the universal, and it allows for people to connect. Because I think as artists, if we set our sights out to try to create a project that reaches everyone and then touches everyone and doesn't piss off anyone, you're making work for no one. You might as well just be making like Costco work. And that's not what we're here to do. We're here to tell our stories. And I think the stories that are most important are the ones that ring true to us, and that come from a really deep, personal, vulnerable space. And I think when we share those vulnerable moments, that's when we show our true strength, because that's what people connect to, and they connect to it on a visceral level. You obviously want to connect with your audience on an aesthetic level, but you want them to also feel something that is much deeper. And you hope that in making that work, you invite them in and you invite them to connect with it. When we release work into the world, we don't know how our audience is necessarily going to read the work and interpret the work, but you hope that it does resonate with other people.
Yeah. I'm gonna jump ahead for the sake of time to a question that I really want to ask you guys about the role of community building and the role of mentorship or teaching, since all three of us are teachers and have taught before. And we've all been involved in artistic communities, and Jeanette, your work with Women Magazine is very important too, I know. So I thought maybe we could say a few words about how you see your role in those ways, outside of making the work itself, your role in teaching and in community building to be connected to activism and advocacy. Some of it might be really direct, but maybe say a few things about that.
Michael,
Jeanette,
did you want to go? Do you want me to go? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Women's Zine, I feel like it's a publication that as Kurt mentioned, that I started with 2 other individuals in 2019. We've published 5 zines so far, and we call them zines, but they're really more like books. They're not really like a photocopier type of aesthetic, which is what happens when you collaborate with 2 book designers. So that the point of Women, basically, for the sake of time, is that we focus on all 5 issues, other than one is international, and each issue is a different, not just a theme. Like our latest theme was like thresholds, and what does that mean to you? But within that theme, we're looking for certain marginalized groups of lesbians. So non-cis lesbians, lesbians who are disabled, lesbians 55 and above, lesbians in rural areas in smaller cities in America. So we're not looking for just anyone, and we're really there to give a platform and a voice to writers and artists who are marginalized lesbians at a time when, particularly within the trans community, really because of like sexism and misogyny, there's a lot of inner fighting within the LGBTQ community, if we're honest about it. And a lot of that falls on the lesbian community. And I feel like, we, even Women's Zine, we were constantly bullied online about why we even exist. We're constantly asked why we're even using the term lesbian, and assumed that we're TERFs and that we're anti-trans because we simply say that we're lesbian. And so I proudly identify as a lesbian and proudly use that term anytime I can, whether I'm in the grocery store or talking about zines, because there are plenty of people who identify as lesbian and who fought very hard to be able to have that term exist. And so I take it very seriously. And it's something that makes sense for me personally to identify as. So in terms of how that shows up in my life, it shows up in my personal work, and it shows up in this publication. And it's something that I'm very proud of, because I think we should all have all different types of zines: gay zines, trans zines, queer zines, and lesbian zines. I don't think we should have more or less of any of it. And so at a time where things are very fluid, I think it's really important to also, if people feel a particular type of identity, to also be able to create that space for themselves. So I feel very proud that we work hard to do that for people. And we're very aware that lesbian can mean many things to many people. And in terms of teaching, I think that, I just sort of taught and wasn't really focused on my role in the classroom. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten more aware of the fact that it is important for me to implement LGBTQ readings. I always show my work, but I don't always talk about being a lesbian until recently. So that's something that I've just started to sort of come to terms with, in terms of, it wasn't at all that I was denying that in the classroom or anything, but it wasn't something that I even registered as a level of importance for my students, as an example, and as a person that can create a safe space for them. So in terms of teaching, I think that that's something that's registered a little more recently for me. And I try to implement that in class discussions. And so that's where it kind of lands for me outside of my art.
That's great. Thank you. And Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so
Especially from teaching.
Yeah, from teaching, it's interesting. When I started 19 years ago, one of the first things I was told was not to put a picture of me and my partner or boyfriend up in the classroom. And I thought it was one of the most mind-blowing things, because I was in a quite liberal community in school. And I was looking at like my coworkers with pictures of you know, their husbands or wives up. And for a long time, I tried to hide my identity in front of my students. And then eventually I just realized that this was ridiculous. And since coming out, it's been a whole lot better because I can speak freely with my students. And I think I can offer them a model and of just being a normal, you know, human being. And then within the context of my teaching, I mean, I teach Spanish. I don't teach art, and I try to infuse art into my teaching whenever I can. But I really try to instill in my students the understanding that it's important that we learn about different people and different cultures and things that are other than what we're familiar with, because so many of us grew up in these bubbles and in these communities, and it's important that we break down these hierarchies that exist within communities. And when we look at different cultures, and we need to stop saying things like, you know, ew, that's so weird, and that's, you know, rather go like, oh, that's different. Let me try to understand this. And so, you know, I'm working with a younger group of learners, but I think it's really important at all levels that we start to break their misconceptions and get them to think a little more broadly about the world around them, and that how the way we do things in one place is not necessarily the right way or the only way. And so my hope is that I get my students to start to think about the world around them in a broader sense, and not just about their own selves and their own communities.
Yeah. Well, and it strikes me, even listening to the two of you, that the vulnerability and personal nature of your art also seems like to relate to what we're saying about teaching, that the revelation of being more vulnerable in the classroom, like saying and revealing a little bit more about our experiences as teachers, that I've found, at least in my teaching, that takes things over the edge in terms of relationship connection with the students, and takes things to a different level where the work even gets better once everyone is relating more at that level. So yeah, it's a small thing, but a major thing, really.
Yeah, it's all about the human interaction. I think if you put up a wall between you and your students, you're not going to get them where they need to be. You have to break down your own walls if you want them to take risks and take chances and opportunity, and, you know, and push themselves.
Yeah. Well, we've got officially 5 minutes left. There's quite a few questions in the chat, so we can jump around at some of these. I just realized that it was a scroll as well. So let me start with the one from Digital Lab. Hi, Digital Lab. Can you talk about finding your audience? Were there many, without there being many galleries or venues devoted to queer photography, can you speak about challenges that you found to getting your work out there and sold?
And sold.
The sold, yeah.
For me, it was all about
My favorite.
it was like almost like I had to create clickbait at first. But I started my Instagram separate from my original account because I wasn't sure whether or not the work was going to take off. So maybe that was just me being slightly you know, doubtful of myself. But it's hard. I think a lot of times LGBTQ artwork is relegated or looked down upon because it is a harder sell in a marketplace that is already a hard sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, I think it's like the traditional things of, you know, if you go to art school, then you might have a community from there and, you know, keep in touch with people. And for me, it's just been about connecting with people in an honest way. I'm not interested in sort of making connections to make connections. You know, I think most of my friends are artists, but I also just like them as people. So I mean, having a good solid community, I think, is really nice. And then through that, naturally, you tend to meet different people who might offer certain opportunities. And I think like applying for things, of course, is a crapshoot for sure, but you know, it can happen, and that's positive. So I think, you know, just applying for things. I think residencies also were huge for me. You know, they can be hit or miss as well, but I'd say at each residency, I've done at least one person, if not a handful of people that I've stayed connected to, who are very dear friends of mine. Sometimes they're in my work, you know, and they just become, for me, it's about building a community of people who are supportive of you and you're supportive of them. And if opportunities land, then that's great, but that's sort of secondary for me, I guess. And
Yeah.
I think queerness also if anything is going to sell, it's often like this under the guise of the term queer, which I think is curious and interesting when a lot of those shows are extremely specific, but it's sort of this title, this banner of queerness. So I think there's a lot to even break down within the community of what are we actually looking at? What is the actual content? And so that's something that within, as someone making work within the community, I like think about a lot as well.
Yeah, yeah. I have a quick question for Jason. Do we have a hard end at 6, or if people want their questions answered, should they stick around for a couple minutes? I also want to be honoring to Michael and Jeanette to let them go as well when we're done. But
I would say 5 minutes or less over the top of the hour is fine.
okay, great. Eileen, thanks for your comment in there. We love you, Eileen. The comment she had was that we make work that draws us in through the art and then makes us stay for the depth of the subject matter. Is there one that comes first for you? Like I think by the art, you probably mean the formal quality of it, like, or is it, or do you see a dichotomy in that?
I think the two kind of support each, it's interesting because I think it depends on whether the viewer reads the statement sometimes, because that can, especially in, more conceptual work, sometimes people don't always necessarily know exactly what the artist's intention is. But I think it's important that the two, whether one comes first or the other one comes next, I think it's important that when all is said and done, that the two become equal supports to the other, and that kind of creates that nice sort of solid triangular formation that allows the work to remain solid and to endure for a longer period of time and not just be there for the aesthetic.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Anything to add, Jeanette? Or
I agree. I think that if I had to really break it down, I think that it's 3 a.m. I think that for me, I really just go more for like the subject matter first, I would say. I think that it's about like building out sort of a concept and idea, and then really fleshing out like the style of it or the aesthetic of it. But it's a chicken or the egg, I mean, it's definitely like all mixed together. But if I had to separate it, I would say I sort of conceptualize something first, and then I kind of start to think about, well, how do I want to actually execute it, like aesthetically?
Yeah. There's a question about, since all of us tend to make such personal work, how do we find the next project that are just as kind of dear to us or near to our hearts? Like, is there a way that that something is the next project? Similarly, there's a question of if when a project is done, how to know that. So I don't know if you want to grab onto either of those or both of those.
When someone breaks up with you.
Oh no. Yeah.
Well, that could be a hard stop for a project. I tend to try to have a few things going at the same time, so that when I feel like my energy or my desire to continue to make one starts to wane, then I can focus some energy into the other one. And I think someone always said, like, when you feel like you're starting to sell out, or your work is becoming redundant or reductive within itself, then you might want to step away from it for a little bit and see whether or not there is that next chapter to it.
Yeah. I'm similar. I have lots of projects going at the same time, I feel like, and that helps with this. But also, I mean, I do things that are last 15 years. I've got projects that are still not done that started 20 years ago. I don't know, like, it's hard to know for me. I think an interesting story related to this that I'll throw in is that with my Northwoods Journals project, it wasn't until I came out to my parents, which I did very late. They were some of the last people in my life to know. Suddenly I had this revelation of that's what the project was about. Like, the whole project was about this concealing of secrets and things we don't say to each other in the family. And I'm talking about things like with my grandmother and things she didn't say to us. The whole time there's this huge thing that I'm not saying to my family. And it was this And then once I came out to my parents, that project was just done. I didn't even want to take pictures for it anymore. And so sometimes I think with personal work, you just have to live into it, kind of keep walking forward to figure out when it ends. So. All right, we're getting a 3-minute warning here. There's a number of great questions. Brandy, hi Brandy, old friend. She had asked earlier about a question for Michael about approaching the community work. That might be a nice transition since I just mentioned my Minnesota stuff. What was that? Approaching the people in the community, how you engaged and communicated with the subjects in Kentucky, I'm thinking she's referring to.
Yeah, so most of the people in Kentucky are friends of the family. So there's always I try to have there be a personal connection between them. And they tend to be people that that Eric's family has known for a while. So that tends to sort of get things started in terms of getting to know them. And then it's usually conversation, chatting for a bit. Sometimes I'll have to photograph them several times, but I move quite slowly. So it enables us to kind of chit chat and kind of break down that feeling of being photographed. I don't know if that answers Brandy's question or not, but it is a slow process, and it's one that I'm looking to try to branch out a little bit on when I return this summer to see kind of where are the gaps in the work and what other individuals can I add into the fold to kind of round out the work and make sure that I'm giving it the dimension that it needs.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's most of it, and we need to wrap up in another minute here. So if there was a question in the Q&A that you really wanted answered, or if you guys see one, you guys could, it looks like you can type an answer back. This is my first time seeing the Q&A section and moderating that. But otherwise, I think that is gonna wrap it up for us.